in general, I've been impressed actually by how many believers put their time and resources into homes for pregnant women who need help. I mean, it, all of these things you see, these, as I say, pregnancy centers, homes for children, nearly all of them are supported by, are started by, staffed by, and financially supported by Christians, believers in Christ. And it's so I think that's a testimony to people putting their money and their finances and their time and their resources where their mouth is. So I can tell you a lot more stories of people who've actually done that also on an individual level. You know, I mean, I just think about like my own parents who took in and housed women who were unmarried and pregnant and didn't know what they were going to do. And in some cases, whose boyfriends had pressured the woman to have an abortion. My parents adopted one of those babies and raised her as their own. So, and then people from their church helped them by subsidizing the adoption and legal fees, you know, thousands of dollars. So, yeah, there are exceptions, but I just don't see the church in general saying, no, we have no interest in supporting financially or otherwise women who choose life for their babies.
Well, Keith, thank you, sir, for joining us on Faith in the Folds. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Kevin. It's good to be with you.
I want to start off this afternoon reading a couple of things that will set our conversation in some context. First is a letter from an Egyptian laborer to his wife, dated June 17th, 1 BC. This gentleman's name is Hilarion, and he writes to his wife, Alice. He calls her his sister, but that's just a convention. Hilarion to Alice, his sister, many greetings. Also to Baris, my lady, and to Apollinarian. Know that we are still, even now, in Alexandria. Don't be distressed if at the general coming in, I remain at Alexandria. I pray and plead with you, do take care of the little child, and as soon as we receive our wages, I will send them to you. If you deliver, if it is a male child, let it live. If it is female, cast it out. You told Aphrodisias, don't forget me. But how can I forget you? I pray, therefore, that you will not be distressed. And then it's dated in the year 29 of the Caesar, and then the month. We can turn to something written at the end of the 1st century, maybe beginning of the 2nd century, known as the Didache. Didache, chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. The second commandment of the teaching is this: you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not corrupt children, you shall not be sexually immoral, you shall not steal, you shall not practice magic, you shall not engage in sorcery, you shall not abort a child or commit infanticide. With these two texts, maybe 100 years apart, we have some very stark realities that we're presented with, where we see the clear instruction of a father to expose a child to commit infanticide, of a child based on that child's sex. And then in this work known as the Didache, for those who may not be very familiar, a Christian work, we see very clear injunctions against two specific kinds of things dealing with children, as far as this topic is concerned. You shall not commit abortion, and you shall not commit infanticide. Now, here we are recording on in the first week of July 2022, and just a few weeks, just a couple of weeks before this, the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, which I believe was originally decided in the 70s. Is that correct? 1972 or something?
Yeah, 1973.
73, okay. It's been interesting watching reactions from my brothers and sisters in Christ on social media respond to, or how they respond to this overturning of Roe versus Wade. Some seem to think that this is as good as gold. Others don't necessarily think that this is the victory that others think it is. And some Christians lament for various reasons. Keith, let me ask you, what kinds of reactions have you seen from Christians, and kind of help us think through some of the things related to this topic?
Yeah. Well, I first of all appreciate you starting with those documents to give us some historical perspective, that these are not questions that have only been dealt with in the last 50 or 100 years or whatever. These are things that humans have been thinking about for a long time, and Christians have been thinking about for a long time. You ask about sort of Christian reactions that I've seen. You mentioned social media. I don't do social media.
And you're better for it, sir.
Okay. What I keep hearing. I do have a Facebook account, but that's it. Don't use it often. I don't kind of scroll through other people's things. So I've not seen much there. I can say that, and I'm sure this is different, in different cities, different subcultures of even our own country, but I've been at the church assembly on 2 Lord's Days since the Dobbs decision was publicized, and have heard absolutely nothing one way or another about it. Church. And that may even include, I would say, private conversations. It hasn't
Interesting.
come up in the public assembly or class or anything. I'm the one teaching the class that I go to, so that could be on me.
That might be an indictment on you.
Maybe so, or a statement one way
Sure.
or another. But there is a reticence when it comes in the congregation I attend, when it comes to anything that could be divisive or anything that could be construed as somehow political. We want to make sure we stay away from and keep politics out of the assembly, which itself is commendable. I think it's interesting how abortion, because politics has gotten involved in abortion in this country, that we think of it as Americans, we think of it first as a political matter, when I would argue that it is primarily a moral issue. But yeah, certainly. So I think that it kind of explains the utter silence at church and why I don't have a lot of evidence to say one way or another. Here's how Christians have been around have responded. There are a few exceptions to that. I do recall a friend, probably the day or the day after, that I was with in person, and we were looking at the news, and he is also pro-life. He's against the practice of abortion. But he said, yeah, that's good. I hope Christians aren't mean about this. And I said, what do you mean by that? Christians aren't, you hope they will not be mean. And he didn't really have a lot to say, but it sort of came down to, he hopes Christians aren't, rubbing it in people's faces, and that he hopes Christians don't somehow think that a political victory is what it means to, be a Christian, or somehow, gives us a leg up, or should be confused with the kingdom of God, all those sorts of things. So there was that. I did see a Facebook post by a friend who, after the decision, simply posted a link to an autobiography by Clarence Thomas, who is, by any reckoning, an impressive figure. His story is very impressive, but he's obviously instrumental in the decision. One of the comments under my friend's post just said, and now I unfriend you.
Oh.
So I don't know if that guy was a Christian or not, but it was just interesting to see the response to my friend's post was someone unfriending him over that.
Yeah, I can't even feign to be surprised, because a lot of too often, and I get this way sometimes too often, that it takes something so small as that, for someone to say, okay, I'm done with you.
Well, yeah, and just to, you don't have to agree with everybody you're Facebook friends with. Being a Facebook friend doesn't mean that they are your best friend or your whatever. Right. Spending a lot of time with them, you're there just to, I guess, be friends and connect. That sort of thing. But to say, I don't even want to hear from you anymore because you posted Thomas's autobiography is, I think, all of this is sort of indicative and reflective of kind of where we are as a society, I think. Just driving around last night, I saw a marquee on a church that said, "Let women decide." So that
interesting.
That kind of tells you what they think about this Supreme Court decision. I always want to let them decide what. Choose what. We want women to decide whether a person or a human being has the right to live, or let women decide whether they should have sex. I'm all for that, but anyway, let women decide.
Yeah, it's interesting. You were talking about the whether the silence or reticence or hesitancy at your church. I think it has been alluded to where I work. I was talking with a friend just earlier this week, who is a preaching minister for another church in Texas, and I'll just say that.
Narrows it to about 1,700 others.
That's right. Yeah.
Churches of Christ, anyway.
Yeah. And as we were talking, he said that a person from their congregation had wondered, after 2 weeks of silence, wondered when he, as the preacher, was going to step up and make a statement about this. And he and I were both frustrated at how this person crafted their argument for why he, the preacher, should make some statement, and why single out him as the preacher rather than say, the shepherds of that particular congregation or any other number of people. It has been strange. There's been quite a variety of reactions, and we've covered a lot of those. Part of what I like to do in conversations like this, really in any conversation that deals with something as significant as what we find in really what I like to do with conversations like these is to root them historically, because I think there's real wisdom, and you and I would agree on this. There's real wisdom in seeing, what did our spiritual ancestors think about X, Y, and Z? Does that give us some insight? Maybe they were mistaken on something. Maybe they are more enlightened than we are on something. And so that's particularly why I opened up with this letter from this Egyptian laborer and from the Didache. Now, biblical passages, specifically biblical passages, do address all kinds of ethical issues. Keith, are there any in the Bible that specifically address abortion?
Not directly. So yeah, you can check your biblical concordance for the word abortion and not find anything in there.
Not find it. Why? I'm asking you to speculate. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, it's a broader phenomenon of the fact that we have our own questions about ethics or morals, or really anything that we kind of questions we face in life. And we say, well, the Bible has all the answers for us, and we might be a little bit flummoxed when we go to scripture and notice, no, it doesn't talk about gun control or artificial reproductive technology or whatever it might be. And obviously there are some reasons why it doesn't talk about some things. In some cases, it could be just the practice was not known in the ancient world. This is not the case with abortion, as what you just read earlier points out. So the practice is known, so that's not why it's not mentioned in scripture. A couple of other reasons it could be. Besides, I mean, some will say that the biblical writers didn't care. That's why it doesn't mention a particular issue or ethical issue.
Yeah.
Could be, but not necessarily. So I think would be the case with abortion. A couple of other possibilities. One is that abortion was less common than it is today, and certainly not the political hot topic that it is. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. It doesn't mean that politicians or kings or whoever didn't have something to say about it or even legislate about it.
I think it's fair to say that it seems in the ancient world that abortion, being for or against abortion, was not a staple in anyone's platform.
Right.
I think that's fair to say.
Not the flashpoint that it is today. So it's not on everyone's radar in the way that it is now because it's just not as common. So even in the instance you mentioned, a lot of getting rid of children would happen after the fact. You didn't know about a child's defects or disabilities until the fact. You didn't know its sex until after. And so those sort of things that now people will select for and make a choice about, perhaps, you didn't have that back then. The other is simply that, and I would say this is the case, the impermissibility of abortion among Christians and before them among Israel was a given. And so it was part of the air breathed that this was not something that would be permitted. There was no debate. In other words, there was no debate about it. So when you see the biblical documents, these are all ad hoc occasional documents that are written by specific authors to address specific human communities in their time and place and situations. And take the letters of Paul, for example, addressing particular problems in these congregations. That apparently was not one of the questions the Corinthians wrote to Paul about.
Yeah.
If he had, I think he would have addressed it. It was not one of the things that divided the Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians in the church in Rome. There were other things that divided them, so he writes about those things. That I think is why Scripture does not directly address abortion as the practice that was known back then.
Yeah. We have to go to, for specifically Christian instances of talking about abortion, we have to go to something like the Didache or some of the other church fathers, also the Epistle of Barnabas, and other letters before we start naming it specifically. In a Christian mindset, I think it would have been understood generally as falling under the broad category of murder. That is the language that is used. You shall not murder by means of abortion. But yeah, it is not mentioned. But what about passages that speak to the personhood of the unborn? You mentioned earlier that it might be somewhat surprising that abortion is a political issue when you would see it maybe more as a moral issue. I think you might also agree too that that there's some elements of a philosophical understanding of what it means to be human involved in this too. And so what does the Bible give us in terms of understanding personhood and how that might relate to one's status as being unborn in utero?
Yeah. So with all of these questions, Scripture may not address the direct question we have about a topic, and here's where I would say, yes, Scripture does have the answers to life's questions. Mm-hmm. And when we read it a little more broadly, to look at the principles that are there, when something's not addressed on a direct rule level, we might say, then we have to look for those principles. And those, I think, are abundant in Scripture. A couple of passages come to mind that address it fairly directly, this question of just sort of the status of the unborn or preborn child. Psalm 139. I think both of these passages are fairly familiar, perhaps, to many Christians, but Psalm 139, starting in verse 13, speaking to God. This whole psalm is a prayer to God. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me when none of them as yet existed. So it's fairly clear there that the writer is seeing this really relational sort of connection with God, even as far back as in the mother's womb, where God is knitting together, it says, these inward parts, fearfully and wonderfully creating and making in the womb before birth. So that one, I think, is about as direct as it gets in Scripture, addressing just this principle of what's the status of this preborn child.
Yeah. I hadn't noticed this before until just now.
Yeah.
But as you're reading those passages and you get this kind of imagery of knitting together and being woven together, it's interesting to cast God as the one knitting and the one doing the weaving, because unless I am mistaken, and if I am, I apologize. My expertise is more New Testament studies and era and culture. But I would assume that knitting and weaving would be more traditionally maternal roles, or rather than paternal roles. And so to describe God in these overtly maternal activities while talking about the child in her mother's womb, I think that's pretty fascinating, and a little nuance there that I hadn't noticed before.
Yeah, that is interesting. I think that's good. Yeah, and of course we would say there's a scientific process happening here. You can describe biologically and all of that, but just as in the, formation of life itself, you can describe it biologically, but the biblical writers see God as intricately involved in all of this. Luke 1 is where Mary goes and visits Elizabeth, who is pregnant with her child. Later, he'll be named John, so John the Baptist. But Mary, who has just received news that she will be with child as well. So the virgin with child, and then this old barren woman with child. But it's what happens when they meet up. So this is Luke 1, verse 41 and following. Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting. The child leaped in her, that's Elizabeth's womb. And Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. And then said in verse 44, as soon as I heard the sound of your greeting, the child in my womb leaped for joy. So I think that's interesting that, again, it's indirect here, but the child is portrayed here as an agent. It's like we would talk about the child kicking or whatever, it's doing something here. What's interesting here, of course, is the timing of it. And, she sees something maybe miraculous happening here. At the very least, on a completely just sort of human level of this story, it's not like just a clump of cells was doing something,
Right. Yeah.
The way that the writer is portraying this, and that Elizabeth apparently is portraying this, that I don't think he necessarily like this preborn baby is understanding what's going on or something, or can process, discursively, and is self-conscious and all those things. I'm not sure that's being suggested by the writer. I'm not suggesting it, but there's something happening here where there's a personality involved, that it's, again, the child is described as an agent that is reacting to a situation. So that's, I think, a descriptive way of how that's being portrayed. But yeah, in both of these, it seems like God is knowing, he's relating to the fetus in the womb. And then there are other passages I would just call a little more indirect that come to mind. Job 10, verses 8 and 9. Won't look up all of these, but Isaiah 44 and Isaiah 49 in a couple of places, maybe others, but talks about the servant of God being formed in the womb. So Isaiah 44, for example, says, he who created you and formed you in the womb, O Israel. Again, it's talking about the corporate Israel there. So it's not about a literal birth, being literally in the womb, but it's a metaphor, and it's using a birth metaphor. And it is, again, this knowing, this creating, and setting apart in the womb. All right. Jeremiah 1:5, Jeremiah has the same sort of language about God knowing him in the womb. So I think those passages are all relevant to the discussion. And maybe any one of them on its own, you could kind of, deny the force that I'm giving to it here, or that I see in it. But all of them together, I think, testify to the importance of something we see throughout Scripture, and that is that children are always a blessing. Even children conceived in, less than ideal circumstances. I don't remember any place in Scripture where they say, well, we should get rid of the child, or the child, doesn't have a right to live. Children are a blessing in general in Scripture, and I think should be seen that way.
Yeah. It's interesting that, especially when you compare that particular aspect, or that particular view of children as a blessing, if you compare that that biblical trajectory with what we see elsewhere in the ancient Near East and even in the ancient Mediterranean worlds, we see a similar kind of thing, at least similar to some degree. I alluded earlier before the recording that the Anchor Bible dictionaries, which is, it's a little dated these days, but still has some really great information. The Anchor Bible Dictionary entry on abortion in antiquity is really illuminating, because it's just a thorough review of ancient Mesopotamian, Babylonian, Hittite, Syrian, you name it, laws concerning induced miscarriage. So, which is something that we see in Exodus. Exodus gets mentioned, but also later laws about the willful destruction of an unborn child, especially in Greek and Roman and in Jewish thought as well, represented in Philo and I think Josephus. That generally there is a concern for the well-being of the child. In these extra biblical sources, the well-being of the child as a potential contributor to the needs of the community and the state. And while that is different from maybe the biblical trajectory, I think there is at least some similarity to where, generally speaking, this child is precious. This child is the key to the preservation of the line or the community or the state or whatever it is. It's fascinating how, despite these differences in cultures across time and space, there is that common thread that runs through a lot of the legislation we find that deals specifically or by way of implication with abortion.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, just in the Roman context, the marriage laws that were passed under Augustus Caesar. So there were requirements for Roman citizens once they reached a certain age to be married. And if you weren't, then you paid a fine, basically a tax on being single. Now, that's about marriage, but the point there also is about procreation and the getting of children, the raising of good Roman citizens also. So yeah, there was legislation there, and there's legislation even in our common laws today when you bracket out abortion that seem to really speak to the personhood, the dignity of the life of the preborn. So, like, I think in most states, if not all, if a pregnant woman is murdered, the perpetrator will be charged with double homicide. That only makes sense if the baby in the womb is treated as a person. I mean, that's what's happening there. So
yeah. There's a lot more that we could get into as far as historical legislation on this and how that might be relevant for discussions of what we see in the biblical text. But I want to move on and ask this. We've alluded to this earlier, but what kinds of attitudes toward abortion do we see throughout Christian tradition, throughout church history? Has there been kind of two camps, like there seems like there are today, or has it been generally one-sided? What have we seen throughout church history on ideas on abortion?
In short, it has been a one-sided take on this, and you've already cited the earliest evidence. In other words, what we're seeing in Scripture, when we talk about what are the principles in Scripture that seem to support a pro-life position and the impermissibility of abortion, is confirmed throughout the early history of the church, and then that is a thread that is dominant throughout the entire history of the church. So the Didache, again, this is end Epistle of Barnabas, which is early 2nd century. Both of these are reflecting 1st century oral instruction in the church.
Yeah.
Moral instruction in this case. So that was not questioned. It was mentioned not because Christians didn't know about, what they should think about this, but because these are instruction manuals, oral catechesis or instruction for pagans who were becoming Christians. So for pagans, it is a debatable question, and practice that was known and done. But for Christians, and for those coming into the Christian community, they needed to be told what is, in that case, in the Didache, it is an expansion of those commandments, the love commandments and the do not murder, as you said, commandment there. And it's just saying, here is a way that commandment is often broken in our pagan culture, but we will not break that in that way in the Christian community. So Tertullian, late 2nd, early 3rd century church father in the Latin-speaking West, also is very clear about the universal Christian prohibition against abortion. And that continues throughout the medieval and into the early modern period, without exception. I mean, there may be debates, in the medieval period. I'm aware of some debates about when the soul actually, comes into the womb and into that child. We talk about when the child when you can feel the child kicking and all of those things. Some had the penalties or the penance laws, penitential laws for people who had abortions before that, or a sort of induced miscarriage, we might say. Sometimes those penalties were decreased or less. Sometimes they were decreased or less when it came to sort of thinking about the circumstances involved. The audience may or may not be aware that it is often men who force women to have abortions. It is even more often the convenience of the man involved. And so those sorts of things would be taken into account. But none of those can be used to say, well, the church at this period or that period didn't care about abortion or just left it up to let women decide. That was never the case. So even contraception, forget abortion, contraception was not approved of in any mainstream churches until 1930. 1930 was when the Church of England, at its Lambeth Conference, approved of the use of contraception. And it was only in 1960 when that became widespread with the birth control pill. And then in the 60s and early 70s, the Supreme Court of the US approved of contraception, first for married people only, and then they opened it up to unmarried people as well. Abortion just came in 1973 as the follow-up to that, a more extreme form of birth control. But all of that was to free people to have sort of unfettered sex and no ties of relationships that children create. Anyway, all that to say, all of this is fairly new in the Christian world. The idea first that contraception is something that should be a part of marriage sexual relations, but especially what was decided by the justices at Roe v. Wade. I don't know of any churches, like church groups before Roe v. Wade, who said abortion is permissible. So this is something that
really
their sign, let women decide. This is something that is certainly more common among Christians now in the last 50 years.
Yeah.
But you don't see it before that.
I have read a little of some of the works published in the early 20th century from an infamous figure known as Margaret Sanger. And for those who are not familiar, she was one of the leading movers and shakers on what was sometimes called the birth control movement. A big eugenicist, which was largely why she felt birth control was such an important thing. A lot of her talks were given in places around her community in the Northeast, but I can't think of a single instance that I've seen where she was speaking at a local church about this kind of thing.
No, I don't think you'll.
She actually strongly opposed church teaching on it because, in her mind, it was this is uncomfortable, but it is simply historical fact that she routinely criticized church teaching as it was brought over by immigrants from places in and around the Italian peninsula who were contributing in her mind to the degradation of society, because so many of these undesirable, that is poor and that is immigrant children were being born. It is ugly to even say that, but these are her words and her thoughts that are readily available online anywhere. Anybody can find her writings.
Yeah, and I'll also say, I should have said this earlier, just in kind of historical survey there, but you mentioned in that very first document the practice of exposing children to the natural elements. That was sort of a late-term abortion, you might say, is that early infanticide. Mm-hmm. And that was an acceptable practice for most people in the Greco-Roman world. A couple of things about that. One is it's interesting to me, just the psychology behind that. I've not really heard anybody talk about this, but the parent who sees the child, oh, it's a girl, or oh, it's, it has these defects or something. The parent doesn't immediately destroy the child or take its life, but kind of let something else do it. Is that not direct murder? I don't know, but let's expose the child to the elements, put it out in the wilderness or the forest or whatever, and let nature take care of it. That is, I think, a testimony to the deep conscience that is within all of us that says, hey, there's something wrong with this, and we have to veil it in some way. And so we don't want to show women, going in for an abortion, an ultrasound, or talk about what the baby looks like, so we sort of blind ourselves to it so that we can sleep at night, perhaps. The other point is that Christians not only opposed abortion in the Roman Empire, but were known for rescuing those children who had been exposed and abandoned by their parents. So their reputation was not just, hey, we talk about being pro-life, but they went out and took those children and raised them as their own. So
yeah, and that particularly is relevant when you look at something like the Didache or the Epistle of Barnabas. The statement that I read, "You shall not commit infanticide," in Greek, that is worded slightly differently. We're using English terminology there, but in Greek, it's very clear, "You shall not kill that which has been born." Right. Is the specific Greek wording of what my translation said, which was, you shall not commit infanticide. And it's very clear, you shall not kill that which has been begotten, basically, that which has been born. I had not considered that line of reasoning, Keith, until I had read your chapter on abortion in your book, Ethics Beyond Rules. I think you do a good job of treating this topic directly and also pastorally, which is kind of tried to be the tone that we've taken here so far. Let me switch gears a little bit and ask about something that is maybe a little more philosophical than, say, historical. I think Christians, based on the biblical trajectory that we looked at earlier, I think Christians can make a pretty compelling argument to at least other Christians for the personhood of the unborn child. But what about from a secular perspective? How could I, a Christian, maybe make a strong or stronger argument for the personhood of this unborn child to a friend who maybe does not have the same religious convictions that I do, or maybe has no special religious convictions?
Yeah. It's difficult in some ways simply because if you have no particular religious faith, then I wonder for that person what is meant by personhood, or the personal dignity, the dignity and worth of life in the first place. So whatever they mean by that, I suppose the way to get at it is, hey, do you think that a born person is worthy of this right to life? If they do, I don't have to ask on what basis do you. I don't, I'm glad if they have an inconsistent view that actually comes out Christian, right? And I think there's a lot of that with the agnosticism and atheism, secularism in our society that still trades on a lot of Christian principles. And one of those is the right to life for everyone. So if they do agree to that, then it's just a matter of asking about, then what's the status of this person before birth? That threshold there, scientifically speaking. And so raising no issues of scripture or principles from Christian tradition, scientifically speaking, with successful conception, there is not one other external thing that is added that would change the genetic makeup of the fetus. So any other threshold that would be suggested is subjective and arbitrary. The DNA at successful conception, the DNA of that human being is complete. What has been conceived will grow into, unless you terminate it yourself,
right,
intentionally, will grow into a baby and an adult human being. So speaking as objectively and scientifically as possible, whatever that conceived thing is spiritually, you can bracket that out. It is biologically a human being. And speaking rationally, I guess my question for someone would be, is there any rationale for a substantial change in the moral status and worth of this human being between the time it's formed at conception and the time it's born? What would be the rationale for some sort of change in its moral worth and status in between those two things? Since nothing is added to it, nothing is done that's different. Okay. That's the best I can do with just, I would say, an argument based on reason alone. And I think I asked that question because I think the burden of proof is on the person to suggest why a substantial change has happened.
I will play devil's advocate just for a moment
Okay.
only because I know that this kind of discussion comes up. And this was something that I had mentioned to you earlier as we were discussing the details of what we would talk about.
Mhm.
One might say that capacity, whether mental or physical capacity or something along those lines, might also be an indicator of personhood. And therefore, due to the unborn child's limited capacities, that might be the reason for which one deems it more reasonable to terminate the pregnancy, kill the unborn child, whatever language one is going to use there. How, from a secular perspective, I think that makes sense, but you and I don't operate from a secular perspective. So maybe help us kind of walk through the relevance of capacity for this kind of discussion.
Yeah. So there is a school of thought in ethics, because this relates not only to the beginning of life questions, but also to end of life questions, is.
Can you repeat that just for emphasis? Because I don't want anyone to miss that point either.
Yeah. Yeah.
Please. Yeah.
We're talking about capabilities, and if that is what defines personhood, that is relevant to a person who has not yet developed those capabilities, that is a baby, or a person who has lost those capabilities, namely an old person who's suffering from dementia or some sort of mental incompetence, someone who's been through a traumatic brain injury, maybe, or is in a persistent vegetative state. All of those kinds of things would apply to them as well. So if you're defining personhood based on, let's call it functionality, all right, whether they can function, what are those functions? If it's some sort of self-consciousness or self-awareness or ability to relate, fine if someone wants to go there, but to be consistent, still the passing through the birth canal does not automatically make that child able now to function in those ways. And so if you're going to say that an unborn child doesn't yet have self-consciousness and those sorts of things, well, neither does an infant, neither do probably toddlers, and so most people would be horrified to suggest it, but there are some ethicists who are willing to bite the bullet, atheists who would say, like Peter Singer and others famously, who would say, yeah, infanticide, up through, the toddler years, up through a couple of years old, is permissible for that reason. So I think, the capability really goes down a slippery slope that, and it is a slippery slope if you have no mechanism to stop the slide, right? And you've taken that away. If it's capabilities of self-consciousness, then not only do the preborn babies go, but your infants and toddlers, your profoundly mentally disabled, those in a vegetative or incompetent state. So there's that. Now, from a biblical point of view, I would say that all of those passages we looked at that sort of seem to respect the preborn life aren't so much about how that child relates to God, but about how God relates to the child.
Yeah.
So if it's about relationship, it's not what the child can do, it's that God did these things to and for that baby in the womb as he's forming it. That's what gives a person dignity, is that we're the recipient of life from God, not based on whether I can, do math or think about myself as a person.
Let's really hope it's not mathematical ability.
Whatever it is, whatever threshold we give to that is, at the end of the day, arbitrary also.
Yeah.
So.
I like the emphasis there too, or highlighting the the fact that the initiative is God's initiative there in the determining and valuing of life. That is very much an act of God's graciousness, to take that divine initiative. I've been teaching a Wednesday evening class here at church on the covenants of the Old Testament. And one thing that we've highlighted several times is, the divine initiative in generating these covenants, whether it's with Adam or Noah or Abraham or the other covenants that we see with Moses and David. Yeah, I can see some kind of a strand of thought that runs through a lot of this discussion related to divine initiative. Sorry, were you going to say? Okay. One thing that I've spent several time talking with a good friend about is this issue of rights, what we might call personal rights or individual liberties or something along those lines. The Bible speaks very highly on the value of human life. I mean, the passages that you gave there are indicative of that, even in what we might call a more brutal society as represented in the Old Testament. There's still a very clear value on human life. It rooted especially in the prologue to the Mosaic covenant. You shall not murder, and among other things listed throughout there. Throughout the Old Testament and especially on into the New Testament, very clear about value of human life. But the Bible does, unless I'm mistaken, it does seem to be relatively quiet on things like personal rights and individual liberties, and those personal rights, individual rights, get brought up a lot in discussions about abortion. And also in discussions about gun control. Now, we're not going to talk about gun control today, but you mentioned that earlier. Yes, here's an example of something that the Bible doesn't specifically mention. Rights do seem to be at least at the heart of or near the heart of the issue with abortion. What place do personal rights or individual liberties have in a Christian worldview? Am I on good ground or a slippery slope if I try to assert that I have certain rights that one should not tread upon?
Yeah, well,
from a Christian perspective.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I would say a lot of vice in our society gets excused on the ground of personal autonomy and rights. And so maybe we should have a bit of a skeptical attitude when that is brought up and is maybe the only thing that kind of is appealed to support or justify a certain practice. Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to talk about rights that are natural that God has given to us. It's another, and I think are worth defending. It's another thing to talk about rights that say the U.S. Constitution grants to U.S. citizens, which I am, and probably most of your listeners are. And I think those should be defended too, maybe on different grounds, because we are talking about perhaps different things. It's a political question on the one hand. The former is a natural and even moral question. But for the Bible, even from a Christian perspective, I would just say it's not all or nothing. It's not like there are no rights or individual liberties, or it's all your autonomous choice and nobody else, relates to that or bears on that question. So yeah, the notion of human rights and individual freedom of choice is based on the Christian worldview. There's a lot, about our enjoying freedom and individual liberties that goes back to a Christian worldview. So according to Christianity, we have the right to call an unjust law no law at all, and to use the language from Acts, to obey God rather than men.
Mhm.
So there, I think that comes into play there.
I'm not used to reading, was it Acts 4 or Acts 5? I'm not used to reading that passage in that light, but that it coheres with my preferences. I might say that, but that seems reasonable, at least to me.
Yeah, and when I say, a law that is unjust is no law at all, I'm just channeling there also Christian tradition, Origen, Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther King Jr. This is famously what he does in his letter from Birmingham jail. And so we're not obliged to follow those laws. In other words, there are rights given to us as humans that supersede any human authority or political authority. There is such a thing as God-given rights.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, I think that, again, that shouldn't be just conflated with Bill of Rights.
Sure.
Some of them I think do overlap, some of them may not. But yeah, there are, I think, some rights that we're called on to defend as Christians. But yeah, so all that to say, yeah, I agree with what you're saying, that at the same time, according to Scripture, individual rights are not unlimited, right? So in a church context, for example, my personal freedom may be restricted by the conscience of someone else. Mm-hmm. Romans 14. In a marriage context, my personal freedom may be restricted by the desires of my spouse. 1 Corinthians 7. Certainly for a Christian, personal freedom is restricted, or ought to be restricted, by one's allegiance to God. So the language of slavery or servant is used in Paul, especially. We are slaves to God. So where's the autonomous choice there? And the point there is when it comes to matters of sin and harming oneself or harming others. And 1 Corinthians 6, 19 and 20, you're not your own. You were bought at a price. Yeah. So that restricts freedom to sin, freedom to harm. All right. So yes, I do agree. Individual autonomy and personal rights as some sort of unlimited freedom of the individual to choose, as defined by modern culture, that is not highly valued in Scripture. The relevance of this to abortion is this a harmless thing that's being done here? You have the autonomous choice to do this. Okay, well, arguably, I would maybe even be tempted to say inarguably, you're hurting another and probably hurting yourself in the process. Yeah. So that there are restrictions on the individual rights and liberties, I think.
Yeah, that helps me clarify some of my own thinking about that. I lean more towards letting folks live with their individual liberties and ensuring that all of those are able to be enjoyed, and then in love and in love and compassion and calls to higher dignity, urging someone voluntarily to maybe see that the way of Christ offers them something that that can help them use their rights and liberties to live more fully, rather than to take those rights and liberties only to find themselves enslaved to sin.
Yes. Yeah.
The last thing I wanted to ask about was maybe some terminology that some people find problematic. So especially after the Roe v. Wade was overturned last week, I see some Christians claiming that their pro-life brothers and sisters are really just pro-birth, and they cite a lack of support for various programs or policies which would benefit mothers. First off, what do you think about that criticism? Do you think that's fair? And if so, maybe what are some effective ways that Christians could support mothers who might otherwise consider abortion if they find themselves hard pressed?
Yeah. I've heard that too, and that's a common criticism, usually I would say from non-Christians, in my experience. But in general, it's not a fair criticism. Now, are there instances of individuals who don't support would-be mothers? Sure. You can always find exceptions to that. The most direct example that I've seen in my own life, just in church work and experience, I've seen this or heard of it more than once, is, you hear of like a church or Christians hesitating to throw a baby shower for a teenager who got pregnant, or somebody who is not married who became pregnant. I don't agree with that, but the sentiment is understandable in this way. Their rationale is, we don't want to condone premarital sex. Okay? And by giving gifts, we're condoning it. I would say you're not condoning it. We need to be a little more nuanced than that. Okay, this is not the baby's fault. All of that. Let's do our best to embrace and give some grace and all of those things. And of course, a lot of this is situational. What's the attitude of the mother and everything. But those are just kind of the individual instances when I can think of someone not being supportive. In general, I've been impressed actually by how many believers put their time and resources into homes for pregnant women who need help. I mean, all of these things you see, these, as I say, pregnancy centers, homes for children, nearly all of them are started by, staffed by, and financially supported by Christians, believers in Christ. And so I think that's a testimony to people putting their money and their finances and their time and their resources where their mouth is. So I can tell you a lot more stories of people who've actually done that also on an individual level. I just think about like my own parents who took in and housed women who were unmarried and pregnant and didn't know what they were going to do. And in some cases, whose boyfriends had pressured the woman to have an abortion. My parents adopted one of those babies and raised her as their own. So, and then people from their church helped them by subsidizing the adoption and legal fees. Wow. Thousands of dollars. So, yeah, there are exceptions, but I just don't see the church in general saying, no, we have no interest in supporting financially or otherwise women who choose life for their babies. So all that to say, I can still answer your second question, though, even though I deny the criticism that it sticks as a general thing. Can we do better? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And is this an opportunity? I mean, the world's going to be watching now, as if they haven't before, but they're going to be watching to see that we pro-life people are pro-life all the way. And so we need to, I think, be even more creative and committed to helping out and showing that we care for the mothers and for these children. So that need will probably be increasing in states where abortion will be restricted or banned now. But every church, so I'm not sure I have the kind of the magic answer to and solution to all of this, but it just seems like some really easy things we can do is that every church and probably every individual Christian who can ought to be supporting institutions that care for vulnerable women who find themselves, pregnant or new mothers, and children who need a home. There are already organizations that do a fantastic job of helping people in these situations. And the ones I know of, a lot of them are just strapped for resources. Shouldn't be. They should have what they need. We should be giving them what they need. We should be volunteering. We should be helping as we can. I've always thought, and this is just a thing I've said over the years and thought about a lot. And whenever I have the venue for saying it, I say it. So here's a venue for saying it. But I've always thought that churches should offer to pay the legal fees for Christian couples in their congregation who want to adopt. It's just, I know the real cost is in the upkeep, not the initial cost there.
Right. Yeah.
But it's a real barrier to a lot of people, I think, who otherwise would adopt when you're staring down just this initial cost of many thousands of dollars. We're talking about 5 digits amount of money, and that's ridiculous. That needs to, so legally, that process needs to be streamlined, adoption, and not made such a burden on people who would love to be provide a home for kids. So
yeah, when I was still in school at Asbury Seminary, their theme for 1 year or a couple of years was attempt something big, and it was a challenge to the student body there to really step out boldly in faith and put yourself in a position where you are ready to do something extraordinary if God does indeed push you in that direction. And I distinctly remember one couple there. I think they both might have been master's students, or at least one of them was, where their attempt something big got to be a pretty widely locally known campaign to urge a mother who might consider abortion to let that couple of Asbury students adopt their baby. And I saw a bunch of their ad campaigns and things like that on social media, and I don't know what happened in that process, but I do think that you have raised at least one very specific way, to a couple of specific ways that Christians can indeed help out in this situation, to put our money where our mouth is, right? To put it kind of colloquially there, to pay the legal fees of a person in your couple in your church is looking to adopt, and to really support with time, energy, and resources local pregnancy care centers and things like that. I think what you have presented here in this little last question, I think that corroborates pretty well with my experience as well, with kind of the voluntary support of organizations and things along those lines. I think one dimension to this criticism of you're not pro-life, you're pro-birth, is the criticism. It lends itself easily to some political criticism where one might be unwilling to have their taxes raised for additional social programs or something along those lines that might help ease a mother's burden, and there may be some legitimacy to that criticism as well. this is just me, and I'm not asking you to share your thoughts on this particular matter one way or the other, but my gut feeling is, as a Christian, my first response should be to support someone voluntarily with my own time and money, and for the church to do that voluntarily, rather than to lean on the state or local governing bodies to do that kind of thing. And so maybe there's some legitimacy in that criticism, but I would say that that's rooted in how I think the church should operate, rather than, or what the church should do rather than what the state should do.
Yeah, in general, I agree with that. I don't think we should be turning over. I feel like in general, we should turn over as little as possible, actually, to the government. It's shown itself over many decades and maybe centuries to be very inefficient at organizing large-scale programs. Okay, so I think the last thing we want is the government, to pay taxes to the government to implement a program to help women who have an unwanted pregnancy or something. Yeah, no, this should be for the churches, for these pregnancy centers that are supported by churches. I would be all for giving them tax breaks, and giving them some sort of incentives. I mean, in some states, you do have states supporting or giving some money to some of those pregnancy centers, though that is not always without controversy also. But if tax money can go to Planned Parenthood, who, have made a lot of money in the abortion industry, then I don't know why tax money couldn't also go to these centers and organizations that support mothers who choose life. And then let them, organize, let those centers who know what they're doing and do it best, let them do it, give them the freedom and the resources to do it. Government wants to chip in with that, great. But I don't think the government, needs to be overseeing any of these things.
Yeah. And again, that's my perspective, and it is rooted in my understanding of how the church ought to operate. So in the comments below, I welcome a charitable discussion about that particular approach.
Charitable discussion on any of these things.
If that's fair. Yeah. We'll just give that caveat as well. Keith, as we wrap up here today, is there anything else that maybe we've missed, or some final pitch or plea or something that you like to bring us home with?
I was thinking of something a moment ago and it slipped my mind. No, I guess not. Just as far as the church goes, I think it's okay to be happy about, first of all, just that the court decided that no, the right to privacy in the U.S. Constitution does not guarantee the right to an abortion. That's all that the court is saying, is that was not in the Constitution. That was not hidden in the right to privacy somewhere. But also, I think there's nothing wrong with simply thanking God that, hey, thousands of unborn babies will not be killed now. Mm-hmm. That's just a fact. And if that's not something we don't have to celebrate it, we don't have to rub people's faces in it or whatever, but if we can't thank God for that and even mention it, to other Christians, then that's too bad, I think. At the same time, as we said there at the end, kind of recognize our responsibility. If this is the way things are going to be now, if we're in a state where abortions are going to be restricted or banned, then those opportunities for putting our thoughts and our words into actions is those will open up to us. So we should also be praying to God to open our eyes for those opportunities to care for those who are vulnerable and need it.
Yep. Yep. Keith, I really appreciate your time, sir. I will, I know there are another handful of venues out there where people can find you doing things with the Center for Christian Studies. You've written a handful of books, particularly this one that I mentioned earlier, Ethics Beyond Rules, where you have a chapter on abortion. From that chapter, I drew a lot of the questions that I asked you today. And so I'll have links to all those things in the comments below and in the description of this video. But I really appreciate your time and appreciate your pastoral approach to dealing with these issues. At no point did I see you gloat or do any of the things that you recommended that Christians not do when it comes to these kinds of conversations.
Thanks, Kevin. It's been an enjoyable conversation.
Yes, sir. Keith, take care. We'll see you next time.